Futures in Fundraising is presented by Alexander Haas. Alexander Haas, transforming institutions that transform lives.
Welcome to Futures in Fundraising. I'm David King, president of Alexander Haas, your host for Futures in Fundraising. We're pleased today to have Mary Wieler, president of the Museum Trustees Association, with us. Mary, welcome to Futures in Fundraising.
Good morning. I'm pleased to be here.
I wanted to ask you, if you would, to get us started, just to tell the audience about the Museum Trustee Association, what you are, what you do, and how the organization came to be.
Well, the Museum Trustees Association is a network of museum trustees from all across the Americas. We represent museums of all sizes, specialties from art museums to children's museums to history museums. And our goal overall is to inspire, inform, and educate museum trustees in their roles and responsibilities. We believe in good governance, and we want to make their job easier and more productive through their service.
So was there a particular person or thing that happened that brought this into existence? You've been involved for a long time.
Yes. So the organization started as a task force of the then American Association of Museums in the late 60s. At the time, the House Ways and Means Committee was threatening to get rid of the charitable deduction. And AAM recognized that to speak to congressmen, they needed influentials, and who better than boards of trustees to represent influential people to deliver the message. So our initial founding was advocacy related and to be a task force. The task force continued into the 70s and broadened its charter to focus on governance. There were some major issues related to museum governance, and they took on that task. By the early 80s, it was clear that the organization had grown, and the task force decided to form its own 501c3. So we've been an independent 501c3 since 1986.
And are your members museum trustees individually, or museums as a whole, or both, or neither?
Both. So we have individual trustees who purchase memberships. Okay. We also have museums who purchase an institutional membership on behalf of their trustees. Okay. And every museum trustee then becomes a member. So it doesn't matter whether you have 40 members on your board or 8. We charge a very affordable rate based on your museum's operating budget. So our goal is to spread the word, and we see it as a very nice benefit and thank you for their volunteer service.
Sure. And a resource for board members to do their job better, I assume.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, you're the head of an association that serves museums and serve museum board members. You're also a board member on at least 2 museums that I know of. So you see a lot of what's going on in the museum world. And I was wondering if from that perspective, as both a board member and a service provider to museums, if there are any trends that you see happening now across the museum landscape.
I would say, so I do serve on 2 museum boards, one an art museum where I've been a longstanding trustee since 1999, but I did take 1 year off because we do believe in good governance and we believe in term limits, and a year off is good, although someone would say she really didn't have much of a year off because we put her on so many committees, she never really left.
You were relieved to go back to the board, right? It was less work.
Exactly. But more recently, I have joined the board of a small history museum in a community where I have a second home. And I find the contrast so important to inform my work. But I came to the organization as a new trustee I had been on the board of the Art Museum for about 2 or 3 years, and our director was very much someone who promoted professional development for his staff, but probably more uniquely for his trustees. And he encouraged us to attend one of the museum trustee sessions. And I really found, well, I had served on other boards. I think 50% of what you need to know as a good board member is probably applicable across the independent sector. 40% is really very museum specific. And I got that museum specific knowledge through the Museum Trustee Association. The other 10% is what I say is the state and local laws that can really trip you up. Yeah. In Maryland, for instance, we have limits on how much you can spend of your endowment. There's sunshine laws in many states about whether you can go into executive session. Where boards get in trouble is not knowing their state and local history, kind of laws. So we at the Museum Trustee Association really try to deal with that 50%. What do you need to know in the museum field to be a better board member? And secondly, are there considerations based on the state in which you operate?
And do you find that there's vast differences between the larger museums? Like, I think a lot of people when they think museum think the High Museum here in Atlanta or the Walters Museum, which you're involved with in Baltimore, and these, the Met, these institutions. But the reality is that most of the museums in this country are much, much smaller than that. And are they facing a different set of challenges, both organizationally and the challenges their trustees face than the larger museums?
I think it really, I don't like to say, oh, the big museums all have the resources and get it right, because we know big museums, it really depends upon which cycle they are in. They have a new director, they're about to embark on a capital campaign. I really look at where are you in the board cycle or the economic cycle of your museum. And I see some really, really good, well-governed, very small museums. And you also see some larger ones that have gotten into trouble. So I think it all comes down to leadership. And are you doing a good job cultivating new board members, keeping them engaged, and having new leadership in the wings to take over?
And so you have had that experience directly going from a fairly large museum to, you defined it, a smaller museum in another history museum, one history, one art, so different there, one large, one small. Were there any things moving from the large art museum board to the smaller history museum board? Was there anything that particularly surprised you about how different that experience was?
Right. Well, I would say this is a museum board that still has what I call the founder core group of volunteers involved. And we are evolving from that, I would call it a little free-form structure to now where they really wanted my help was to help formalize some governance, update the bylaws, create some standing committees. But they don't want to stop having fun and having coffee once a month and donuts. It's very community driven. Yeah. And it's a lot of fun because, being in a more established board like the Walters, we have a different culture. And I would say I come from a different culture, and it's been very rewarding to work around and listen. Listen is key. Listen to the people who say, I don't want to have such a formal thing. We want to have fun. This is a fun board. Don't take away our fun. That was the big message. And so we're working to balance the fun and formalize some best practices.
And the serious work and responsibility of being a board member.
Correct. And I would say board education is evolving with the smaller museums. So,
Great.
it's a real joy to work with them.
Well, we find that with all organizations, that's part of the growing pains as you grow, and the board needs to evolve in some way. It's a challenge for organizations.
Right. Well, and I think, in a smaller community, it appears that you have less people to choose from. And therefore, it's very important to broaden your network and assess, okay, what does our board look like now? Are there other members of the community that we don't have represented, or skill sets or professional identity that can help us move forward and grow? Because they're at sort of an inflection point. They've just closed a $2 million capital campaign for a storage and education center, but they're on to the next project. And, I think all boards today are trying to represent the makeup of their community as best they can.
So in what we do as fundraising consultants, people often think that we might charge our fee based on the scale of the campaign, and that a bigger campaign we would charge a lot more than a smaller campaign. And I'm constantly telling people that it's actually what should happen. It doesn't, but is the inverse should be the case, because the institutions that are large and powerful and have strong boards and have very capable philanthropic boards, their campaigns, even though the scale is much larger, tend to be easier. They tend to have much more room for error. And the smaller organizations, maybe they haven't done campaigns. They may only have one prospect for the lead gift that they need. There's no margin for error, and it's a lot more hand-holding and heavy lifting with the smaller organizations.
Well, and I think as this group has emerged from an all-volunteer group, the fundraising that was done for that $2 million was the job of the director and a cohort of volunteers. There is no development staff. And so in our strategic planning retreat this winter, we said, perhaps we should really invest in some sort of development associate to take off some of the burden day to day of annual giving, chasing the capital campaign pledges, etc., membership from the executive director. And if that person does their job really well, I don't need to explain to you, they should be returning 3x to 5x their base salary. So, but we're at that point where we're looking at that personnel investment.
There's also the benefit of freeing up the director's time for perhaps more high-level stuff than making sure the pledge payment reminders get in the mail.
Correct. And I think that's one of the things that we're looking at, the staffing, and as you say, freeing up. The director should not be mailing renewals.
We're going to take a very quick break, and we'll be right back with more from Mary Wieler.
What project am I most proud of? Well, I think all of them, to be honest, because they are all different. And that's one of the reasons I love working with Alexander Haas, is there is no cookie cutter approach. All of our clients are different. I am particularly mindful of the work that we have done with Converse College in helping them with reorganizing their development program. But I was also extremely pleased with a very significant project we did with the American Libraries Association and the work I'm currently doing with Cody College. All three of those very different, very unique, all with different rewards. I loved every single one of them.
Welcome back to Futures in Fundraising. Today we have Mary Wieler, president of the Museum Trustee Association. Mary, we were talking about your experience in a small museum and some of the differences between an organization launching a very large capital campaign and sort of the heavy lifting that goes on when you're a small organization that maybe doesn't have staff. You have the perspective of being both a donor and a professional fundraiser now in your role at MTA. So I wanted to ask you if you could talk some about fundraising and maybe some like the good, the bad, and the ugly of what you've experienced on both sides of the table.
Right. So when we talk about fundraising, I think the very first thing when you're cultivating someone to join a board, you don't dodge the question, what should I contribute? You should be very clear in what your expectations are. And again, it depends upon the museum culture. You could have a specific dollar amount, a board average, a range, but be specific. Everybody on a board must give. Secondly, if you have expectations that they need to get funds, to sell tickets to the gala, to sell lecture series, anything like that, specify it. Don't surprise them and say, well, didn't you know you had to buy a table at the gala? And I'm a big believer, if there are other things like attendance, coming to events, bringing your friends, specify it, and then put it in writing. Almost create a board contract so board members really know what their expectations are. And if it's you must give an annual gift or we're about to have a capital campaign, let's be clear, because we work so hard at cultivating those new board members. Don't mess up by not engaging them properly. And I've seen that happen, and people said someone didn't tell me. So I'm really an advocate about clear expectations from the get-go. I will tell you, it's very interesting to have been a long-time donor. I've always been active on development committees and so forth. Mm-hmm. But when you're in a staff role like I am now with the Museum Trustee Association, I see a very different side of board members. And I always say the staff should not be chasing the board member for their gift. It is now the end of May. Many boards end at the fiscal year of June. Their best use of time is not chasing Mary Wieler for her annual pledge or her capital campaign gift. She should be chasing David King. He's a donor. He's not on the board. Use your staff resources wisely. And my message to staff, don't overlook the details. My name is Mary Wieler. Sounds really like an easy name to spell. It's the German way, W-I-E-L-E-R. Needless to say, it gets confused many times. And I've even served on boards where my name is misspelled. So do get the little things right and always say thank you. I got the best thank you the other day. I made a gift to an organization I had just been observing. They didn't solicit me. And I got a handwritten note from a board member.
Wow.
I went, wow, he doesn't know me. This is, this was sort of a spur of the moment idea. How impactful was that to me? It also is simple too. Have a thank you night, just dial on the telephone, leave voicemails. Voicemails, again, it's always a pleasure to be thanked. And my other sort of pet peeve, and this goes to capital campaigns, you can create an architecture around giving and naming opportunities, but don't try to pigeonhole a donor in a box. Listen to what their dreams are. Listen to what stirs their passion. Don't try to put them in a box and check it off. I'm a big believer in being a little flexible around the needs of the museum and see if you can't, over time, encourage them to make a gift that really speaks to their heart, because ultimately, I think that's what motivates giving.
So we talk with our clients about getting out of the fundraising business and getting into the development business, and that if they develop good relationships with people, that the fundraising piece will take care of itself.
Yes.
And that just because somebody has money and you need money doesn't mean you have anything in common, that you've got to be an active listener and find the areas where the donor's interests and the things you're trying to accomplish coincide. And that's the inflection point where you can really engage a donor.
Right. And I really think, and I've witnessed this having served on different boards, when you leave a board, you really want to keep that person engaged and cultivated. But then when you have, like, a museum director may leave, or the head of the development staff, and very quickly you lose all personal contact. Yeah. And especially as people age, and we're reading about the greatest generation and the wealth transfer to come, but it is very difficult to maintain relationships with people as they age. And I see this with my parents. And I say to museums, you really need to have a donor's intention if they want to leave a legacy gift in their will by age 75.
Yeah.
Because it becomes more difficult to keep track. You have to have relationships with children, and the turnover of development staff is real.
It's a huge problem.
Yeah, and I see this, just with the Walters, we just completed a $10 million capital campaign, and I asked someone on the development staff, "Oh, have you approached Mrs. So-and-so?" And they said, "No, we don't really know her anymore. She's quite elderly." And I said, "I'll make the phone call." And I did. And she's completely re-engaged. She made a 5-figure gift. And best of all, she's bringing one of her children to the annual dinner. Perfect. And I said, make sure you know the children, because they want to continue their mother's legacy.
So one of the things we try to encourage our clients to do, and as a way to engage and use their boards, but also to your point about keeping up with donors, is on your top, let's say 100, I'm just making that number up, but on your top list of donors, endeavor to have 2 relationships with the organization, one with a board member or other volunteer who's not going anywhere, and then the other with a staff person, because there is turnover in staff, and the development staff situation right now is really problematic. The last number I saw was that the average tenure was 16 months, which is really ridiculous. Right. But you also have museum directors who move too. And what we talk with our clients about is you don't want to have to start this relationship over cold. You need somebody else who has a relationship, who can introduce the new director or introduce the new development director or make that transition happen.
Yeah. Well, and you bring up a good point, which during an executive transition, often funders are reluctant to make annual gifts until the dust settles, they see who the new person is. And that's where the board and staff really have to get the first 90 days to 6 months right, and meet all those major stakeholders, whether they're donors or local government officials, because development also is not just to people or individuals, it's also to government. Government can really make a museum's life much more pleasant.
Or not, if they choose.
Or not, exactly. And so having those relationships matter, and I think investing in those relationships, advocating not only just for the field, but for your particular museum at the city and state level is very important.
We talked some about board responsibilities. If you, and I haven't given you a heads up on this, so I know you don't have a list in front of you, but if you could tick off a few things that you would recommend museums or any organization do as it relates to their board to make it better, what would that be?
I would, well, as I said, initially, make sure your agenda is clear with their expectation as you onboard them. And do a really good job of onboarding them. That orientation day, meeting the staff, make them feel welcome, even if they've been a donor. Everybody likes to go see that storage area or the behind the scenes, see the pipes that aren't working. It's the best, positioning for a capital campaign. But also make your board meetings interesting. I wrote a piece once called, "Are you bored at your board meeting?" And I got a lot of absolutely. Don't make the agenda full of reports that could be put in a consent agenda and read in advance. People want to engage in strategic thinking or making decisions while you have them. Use their time really well. Make them feel like, I really contributed something. This was really a good use of my 2 hours today. And then I would say, touch them in between the board meetings. Personally, a phone call. It never hurts for the director to pick up the phone and say, "Mary, we haven't seen you. Do you know this exhibit's opening? I'd love for you to come." Make them feel welcome. Make them then be your ambassadors in the community to encourage them to bring others to the exhibit. And I think constant communication is the key to a successful board staff relationship.
I think whenever we encounter a staff person, typically an executive director or a president or whatever that CEO title is in an organization, who indicates to us that they have a big problem with their board, it always comes back to not having shared expectations of what board membership was supposed to be in that particular organization. And we recommend, you talked about this some too, we recommend having a job description for board members.
Correct. I think that's excellent.
And
excellent.
Share it with them at the time that they're recruited. And if they can't agree to the job description, then just like you wouldn't hire a staff person who couldn't fulfill the job description, don't recruit the board member if they're not willing to meet the expectations.
Correct. Right. Because you don't want disappointment on both sides.
And that's what you end up with.
The next recruiting, especially if you're part of a company and work at salary, you want to make sure those expectations are clear. I'm also, and when I'm talking about communication, I think we're all suffering from inbox overload with emails. And that's why even with the Museum Trustee Association, I pick up the phone. I send handwritten notes. I've gone back almost to the old technology as a way to keep in touch with my board. I'm dealing with a national board, so Sure. It's not like I have them easily coming to exhibits. But I think using all the tools in your communication toolbox is the way to go.
And I think understanding, treating your board members like individuals and knowing which ones would prefer that you send them a text or an email and which one really would prefer that you pick up the phone and call them.
Exactly. That personalization, text works well with really certain people and others don't read their emails.
Another thing that we find will derail a board, and this happens again at the point of entry, is a staff person or often another board member, excuse me, who's so intent on getting someone to join the board that they craft a special job description for that person, and they end up doing that with several people. So you have these different sort of classes almost of board people, some who aren't expected to give, some who aren't expected to ask, some who aren't expected to come to meetings, and you have all these different expectations, so no board member has the same job, and you get confusion and resentment and all kinds of problems from that. Excuse me. Mary, thank you for joining us today. It's been great to have you. I thought this was a great conversation about leadership and governance. And we appreciate you taking the time to do it. And we hope all of you will join us again next time for Futures in Fundraising.